The arrows hit him before he understood what was happening. 3 of them, in rapid succession. The kind of shots that meant someone had been waiting, had been positioned, had known exactly where he would be standing. Marcus Webb had been a field specialist for the Interstellar Liaison Corps for 11 years. And in 11 years, he had developed the instincts that keep people in dangerous work alive. He had known, in the half-second between hearing the release and feeling the impact, that this was intentional, that someone wanted the child beside him dead. He had stepped in front of her anyway, not because protocol required it. The child was not his assignment. He had been passing through, on his way between sectors, stopping at the Corrali refugee settlement on the outer rim, because a colleague had asked him to check on supplies. The child had simply been there, standing in the open. A small Corrali female of perhaps 4 or 5 years by their developmental markers, wearing the distinctive copper-threaded clothing that identified her as belonging to one of the first bloodlines. He had seen the positioning of the shooters in his peripheral vision 1 heartbeat before the arrows released. He had moved without decision. The way you move when your body understands something before your mind has finished processing it. The 3 arrows went into his back, his shoulder, and his side. The child was untouched. The last thing Marcus registered before the venom began shutting down his central nervous system was the child's face, wide silver eyes, the faint bioluminescence at her temples that Corrali children expressed when they were frightened, and something else. Something he did not have time to analyze, because the world was already going dark. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on any face, human or otherwise, something that was recognition, grief, and ferocity compressed into a single moment. He did not know then, and would not know for 30 years, what that expression meant. The toxin in Corrali assassin arrows was not designed to kill in the conventional sense. This was the first thing the Liaison Corps medical team explained to his family when they were notified, 4 days after the incident, that Marcus was alive, but that alive required considerable qualification. Corrali assassin venom was a biologically sophisticated compound developed over centuries of internecine political conflict in a civilization that had been at war with itself at various intensities. For longer than human civilization had existed, the venom attacked the neural architecture, not destroying it, because destruction was crude, but suspending it, wrapping each neural pathway in a biological compound that mimicked the chemistry of deep hibernation and held it there, stable but inactive, until the compound degraded. The compound did not degrade quickly. In Corrali physiology, the degradation timeline was measured in months. One of the assassin venom's applications in their history had been exactly this, rendering a political opponent incapacitated for a season, while their enemies consolidated power, then allowing the venom to run its course, and the target to wake in a world that had moved on without them. In human physiology, the timeline was entirely unknown. The Liaison Corps medical team had never encountered this situation. They ran analyses. They consulted with Corrali medical specialists who were willing to speak with them, a limited number, given the political sensitivity of what had happened and the questions the shooting raised. They used every modeling tool available. Their best projection ranged from several years to several decades. The uncertainty was not something they could narrow further. Human neural chemistry interacted with the venom in ways that their models could not fully capture. He might wake in 5 years. He might wake in 30. He might not wake at all, though that outcome became less likely as the initial weeks passed and his body's vital signs stabilized into a pattern consistent with sustainable suspended state. They placed him in a care facility on a station in the neutral zone, close enough to Corrali space that specialists could consult without crossing territorial boundaries, far enough from Earth that the political complexity of his situation would not create immediate diplomatic problems. They maintained his body. They monitored his neural activity, which was low but present, the dim, patient hum of a mind waiting. His family came. His mother, his sister, his younger brother, who had been planning a wedding and postponed it for 3 months, before accepting that Marcus's timeline made further postponing unrealistic. They sat with him. They talked to him because the medical team said it was possible he could register some of what was said, filtered and distorted, but possible. They told him about their lives continuing. They apologized for continuing. And then they returned to those lives, because lives cannot stop for an indefinite suspension. The station held him. The monitors tracked the faint hum of his neural activity. Years accumulated. While Marcus Webb lay suspended in the neutral zone facility, the political situation that had produced the assassination attempt was in the process of transforming in ways that would have been almost impossible to predict from its starting conditions. The child whose life he had protected was named Sarah Vail. She was the 3rd daughter of the Vail line's secondary branch, positioned in the complex genealogical mathematics of Corrali succession in a location that should have meant comfortable irrelevance. 3rd daughters of secondary branches were not targets. They were not important enough to target. The assassination attempt had revealed that someone disagreed with this assessment. What that someone had understood, and what the broader Corrali political sphere would slowly come to understand over the following years, was that Sarah Vale was not the person her genealogical position suggested she was. The capacity that Corrali children of the first bloodline sometimes exhibited, a deepened sensitivity to the resonant field that their civilization had built its philosophy and its political legitimacy around, had appeared in her at an intensity that had no recorded precedent in the historical literature. The people who had tried to kill her before this became undeniable had understood early. They had tried to prevent what the field had already, in some sense, determined. They had failed because a human field specialist passing through a refugee settlement had seen where shooters were positioned and had moved without deciding to move. The consequence of that failure unfolded across 30 years in ways that neither Marcus nor Sarah could have witnessed together. His absence from consciousness did not mean his absence from the story. In a civilization that measured its most sacred obligations by the concept of the life debt, the understanding that a life given in protection created a bond that no political calculation could supersede. His name was spoken in context that would have astonished him. Sarah Vale grew. She grew under protection that the near assassination had now made a priority. She studied under teachers who recognized what they were dealing with and who understood that their students' education was not simply personal cultivation, but the development of something the civilization needed. She learned the resonant field's deepest applications, not as theory but as practice, because in her the practice was available in ways that most students could only approximate. She also asked questions about Marcus Webb, repeatedly, with the specific persistence of someone who considers the subject non-negotiable, to understand what was building in Corrali civilization during the years of Marcus's suspension. You need to understand what the life debt meant to them. It was not a transactional concept. It was not a favor owed, an obligation to be discharged through some equivalent act, a social contract that could be satisfied and then concluded. The Corrali understanding of the life debt was rooted in their foundational philosophy about the nature of connection between living beings, the belief that when one life was genuinely risked in defense of another, something more than gratitude was created. Their word for it, the closest translation was something like resonant binding, described what their science and their philosophy both recognized as a measurable phenomenon. Beings who had stood in the specific relationship of protector and protected, when the protection had involved genuine mortal risk, showed detectable changes in their field signatures. The resonant field that Corrali civilization had built its institutions around was demonstrably affected by life debt relationships. This was not mystical from their perspective. It was documented, replicable, and understood through the same epistemological framework that human science would call empirical. What it meant practically was that the life debt relationship was among the most significant social facts in Corrali civilization. Rulers who denied a life debt lost legitimacy in ways that could not be recovered through political maneuvering. The obligation was written into their most fundamental legal structures, their philosophical texts, their religious practices where they had them. It was not a cultural ornament. It was load-bearing. Sarah Vale had a life debt to Marcus Webb. In the years following the assassination attempt, as her position in Corrali civilization elevated from irrelevant secondary branch daughter to something that required entirely different political vocabulary, this debt was not forgotten. It took 12 years for the full scope of what Sarah Vale was to become undeniable to the Corrali political establishment. Those 12 years were not peaceful. A civilization that has been at political war with itself for millennia does not smoothly accept the emergence of a figure who represents the kind of authority that the resonant field bestows on those rare individuals in whom it fully manifests. There were challenges, political, philosophical, and several that required the kind of physical protection that her security detail earned their designations for. The people who had tried to have her killed when she was 4 years old had successors who shared their assessment of the threat she represented. Those successors were not passive. She survived. Not only survived, she grew through each challenge in ways that her advisors documented with the careful language of people witnessing something they believe their grandchildren will study. She navigated the political architecture of a civilization she was in the process of reshaping without destroying it. She extended the resonant field's reach in ways that made her position increasingly difficult to contest on any terms that Corrali civilization recognized as legitimate. At 22, she was designated Resonant Prime, the first such designation in 400 years. At 26, when the political consensus that had been building for a decade finally reached the threshold required for formal confirmation, she was confirmed as the Empress of the unified Corrali sovereignty. On the day of her confirmation, in the address she gave to the gathered assembly of representatives from every Corrali territory and every significant non-Corrali civilization with which they maintained formal relations, She said something that those present would discuss for years afterward. She said that her ascension carried a debt that the sovereignty would honor and that she would personally honor before any other obligation the position created. She named Marcus Webb by his full designation, Marcus Aldrich Webb, Field Specialist 3rd Class, Interstellar Liaison Corps, Human Sector 7, and stated for the formal record that his life had protected hers, and that nothing she had become was separable from that fact, and that when he woke, whatever he needed from her civilization would be provided without negotiation. The representatives from the Liaison Corps in the assembly sent an encrypted message to their sector commander before the address had concluded. The sector commander forwarded it to the neutral zone facility with a single-line note. He should know this is happening even if he cannot currently know it. The medical team that staffed the neutral zone facility had rotated through multiple generations of personnel in the 27 years since Marcus was brought there. The current team were professionals who had inherited a patient and a case file, and the particular institutional relationship with indefinite uncertainty that long-duration suspended care creates. They were good at what they did. They maintained vigilance that 2 decades of absence of change might reasonably have eroded. They ran the monitoring protocols with the consistency that their predecessors had run them and that their predecessors' predecessors had run them. So it was the current team's lead technician, a young woman named Dr. Yuka Osei, who had been with the facility for 3 years and who had inherited this patient with the same equanimity with which she had inherited all her other long-term patients, who noticed first. The neural activity monitor was showing a change, not a large change, not the sudden dramatic spike that the monitoring protocols classified as emergency indicators, a gradual, consistent directional change. The faint hum of minimal activity that had been stable for 27 years was developing texture. Complexity was returning to the signal. Osei logged it. She ran verification protocols. She called in the senior physician. She sent notification to the Liaison Corps sector office and to the list of designated contacts, which after 27 years had condensed significantly. Marcus's mother had died. His brother had moved out of contact range. His sister, now in her 70s, was still listed. She also sent notification to a secure diplomatic channel that had been added to the notification list 11 years ago, when the Corelli Empress had formally established a permanent diplomatic liaison at the neutral zone facility and had specified, in the most direct possible terms, that she was to be notified immediately and personally of any change in Marcus Webb's status. The response from the Corelli diplomatic channel arrived 47 minutes later. It was from the Empress herself. It said, "I am coming." The Venom's degradation, when it finally reached completion, did not happen all at once. It happened the way winter ends in places where winter is real. Not a single day, but a direction that becomes undeniable. Neural pathways that had been suspended for 30 years reactivated in sequence, beginning with the autonomic systems that the Venom had maintained in minimal function throughout and progressing outward into the higher systems that had been fully dormant. Marcus's experience of it was not linear. Consciousness does not return like a light switching on. It returns the way a signal returns through static, fragmented at first, building toward coherence through stages that felt from inside them like a sequence of increasingly vivid dreams that gradually became indistinguishable from waking. He had been 34 when he went under. He was 64 when he came back. The math of those 30 years was something his mind encountered piecemeal rather than all at once, which was probably the merciful way. The medical team that was present when his eyes opened had prepared for the disorientation that 30 years of suspension would produce. They had protocols. They had specialists. What they had not fully prepared for was the specific quality of Marcus Webb's return to consciousness. He had been, by his record, a methodical and highly analytical person whose professional performance had been characterized by the kind of deliberate observation that his field work required. That quality apparently survived 30 years of suspension because his first words, once he had established basic coherence, were a question. He asked, "Did the child survive?" The lead physician told him yes. The child had survived. He asked if she was safe. The physician was quiet for a moment, which he registered even through the fog of returning cognition. She said, she's here. She's waiting outside." He processed this. Outside this room? Outside this facility. She arrived 2 days ago. She's been waiting. He lay with this for a while. The room was quiet except for the sound of monitoring equipment that he had not heard in 30 years, and that therefore he was hearing for what felt like the first time. He said, "How long was I out?" 30 years. He closed his eyes. He opened them again. How old is she now? 34? 35 next month? He did the math that his mind was capable of doing and arrived at a result that raised a question he was not yet certain he understood how to ask. He said, "Who is she now?" The physician's expression was one of a person choosing how to deliver significant information to someone who is not yet fully equipped to receive it. She said, "She's the Empress of the Unified Corrali Sovereignty." Marcus stared at the ceiling of the neutral zone facility for a long time. They gave him 2 days. The medical team insisted on it, and the diplomatic channel through which the Empress communicated during those 2 days supported the insistence without objection, which was its own form of communication about who she was now. He needed the 2 days, not primarily for the physical recovery, though his body required recalibration in ways that 30 years of minimal function had created. He needed them for the accumulation of information that 30 years produced. His sister was still alive. They had a conversation via secure transmission that he found difficult in ways he had not anticipated. She was 79 years old, a grandmother several times over, and she wept in a way that he had no framework for responding to, because he had no continuous experience of the 30 years that had produced the accumulation of grief and relief. Her weeping contained. She had been 19 when he went under. She was 79. He could see both simultaneously and reconcile neither. His mother had died 15 years ago. His brother's family was large and scattered across 3 sectors. The liaison corps had changed significantly in organizational structure. His direct colleagues from his field years were retired, relocated, or also gone. He was 64 years old and he had been absent for 30 years, and the world had not waited. He thought in the second night of those 2 days about what it meant to grieve this. He decided that what it meant was that it had to be done, and that it would take longer than 2 days, and that the fact that it would take longer did not mean it could be postponed until he had done it in full. He was not the same person who had stepped in front of 3 arrows in a refugee settlement. He was not fundamentally different either. The core of him had been held in suspension, and the core had emerged from suspension intact. What had changed was everything around the core, the context, the age, the world. On the 3rd day, he told the medical team he was ready. He had not known what to expect. An official delegation, perhaps, the kind of structured diplomatic encounter that the relationship between an empress of a major alien civilization and a retired human field specialist might logically take protocol interpreters. The visible machinery of formal engagement. What came through the door of his medical room was one person. She was tall, the Corrali tended toward height, and she had the additional bearing that came from 30 years of developing both authority and the field sensitivity that her position rested on. The copper thread clothing she wore was not the elaborate formal regalia of what he had been shown in the archive footage. It was simpler, closer to what a person wears when they want to be who they are rather than what they represent. The bioluminescence at her temples that frightened children expressed as blue, she had been told he would later learn that the specific color indicated the resonant field engagement she was maintaining to keep herself composed. It was involuntary. It was also, by the standards of what she could now do with the field, quite modest. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He was sitting up in the medical bed, 64 years old, 30 years older than he had been when he last saw a version of this face. A 4-year-old's face, wide-eyed and bioluminescent in fear, looking at him as the venom began to take hold. She crossed the room. She did not sit in the chair that had been placed beside the bed for visitors. She knelt on the floor of the medical room of a neutral zone facility. The Empress of the Unified Corrali Sovereignty knelt in front of the man who had stepped in front of arrows meant for her, and she did not say anything. The silence lasted long enough that he had to decide what to do with it. He said finally in the careful Corrali that he had learned in his field years and that 30 years of suspension had not touched. "You don't need to do that." She said, "I know I don't need to. That's why I'm doing it." He said, "Get up. I'm the one who should be." "No," she said not harshly. With the absolute quiet precision of someone who has spent 30 years becoming certain about something. "You protected my life before you knew my name, before I was anything other than a child in an open space. You had no obligation. You chose the life debt is real and the sovereignty honors it. But what I'm doing right now is not the sovereignty. This is me. This is 30 years of knowing that I am alive, because a human who did not know me and owed me nothing made a decision in half a second." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember deciding," he said. "I just moved." "I know," she said. "That's the thing that stayed with me. You didn't calculate, you didn't weigh anything. You just moved," he said. "Yes." She stood then. Not because the moment was resolved, but because the moment had become something different, not ceremony or protocol, but the beginning of an actual conversation between 2 people who had been connected for 30 years by an event that lasted half a second. In the days that followed the first meeting, the nature of the relationship established itself gradually. He was recovering. She had obligations that her diplomatic team managed with the particular skill of people long practiced at giving their empress the time she had decided to take without letting the sovereignty's business collapse while she took it. They talked. The conversations were not always easy, partly because the 30-year gap in Marcus's continuous experience made it necessary for him to receive enormous amounts of information before he could be fully present in a conversation about the present. And partly because Sarah, the name he used which she had told him to use, which her security detail registered as significant because she permitted almost no one to use it, was a person whose depth had been built through 30 years of extraordinary experience, and who was navigating the specific challenge of talking with the person whose half-second decision had enabled all of it. She told him about the assassination attempt from her perspective. She had been four. She had understood less of what was happening than her expression in that moment had suggested. What she had understood was that this person, this human, she had never seen before, was hurt because of her. That the arrows had been meant for her and had not reached her because his body had been between them and their target. She had been taken away by her protectors before she lost consciousness. She had not known for years what had happened to him after. When she had been old enough to understand the situation fully, 12, 13, the age at which her teachers had judged, she could receive the full account. She had asked for the records. She had read them. She had asked why the neutral zone facility was being maintained entirely by the liaison corps rather than with Corrali participation. She had changed that within 3 months of the conversation. "I've been paying for the facility since I was 13, she said. "The sovereign treasury has funded half its operations for 22 years. He did not know this. He had not been in a position to know it, but the information had a weight that he was going to need time to process. "I didn't want you to wake up to a world where no one remembered," she said. "I couldn't control what the world remembered. I could control what resources were available to the people keeping you alive." He said, "You were 13. I was 13, and I had access to resources, and you were in a facility that needed them." The logic wasn't complicated. He thought about a 13-year-old girl redirecting the resources of a sovereign treasury to keep a human field specialist's neutral zone medical facility properly funded. He thought about what that said about the person she was then and the person she had become. "You've been thinking about me for 30 years, he said. "You saved my life," she said. "I was never going to stop thinking about you." What Marcus had to sit with, and sitting with it was genuinely difficult, was the asymmetry of their 30 years. She was also, he could not avoid knowing, 34 years old, and he was 64. That gap was something she did not appear to factor into her thinking in any limiting way, and he was not sure what to make of that. He asked her about it directly eventually. She said, "By Corrali developmental reckoning, you are younger than I am." He said, "By what possible measure?" "Continuous living years," she said. "You were 34 when you went under. You experienced 34 years of continuous life. I have experienced 34. We are the same age in the ways that matter to me," he said. "That is a generous interpretation of an unusual situation." She said, "It is an accurate interpretation. The question is what you do with the accuracy." The life debt, Sarah had said in her confirmation address, would be honored without negotiation. In the weeks following Marcus's waking, the practical shape of that honoring was laid out by the diplomatic team she authorized to speak with him, with her present, which was itself a signal, because empresses did not typically attend the logistics of debt fulfillment as observers. He was offered whatever he wanted. The language was as literal as it sounds, and when he probed for the edges of it, they confirmed what the language suggested, whatever he wanted. His liaison corps career had been interrupted at Field Specialist 3rd class. They offered to restore it at whatever level he specified, with 30 years of suspended service credit. They offered him a position within the Corrali diplomatic apparatus if he wanted to work within their civilization rather than as an external liaison. They offered resources, financial, material, medical, calibrated to whatever level he felt appropriate for 30 years of missed living. They offered him a residence in neutral space, in Corrali space, in human space, or any combination. They offered him time. He sat with all of this for a long time. What he eventually said was that he wanted to work, not because he needed to financially. He was not naive about the scale of what was being offered, but because 30 years of suspension had left him with the particular hunger of someone who has been held still too long. He wanted to move. He wanted to be useful. He said he would like to continue doing liaison work if the liaison corps would have him back, but that he would like to do it in a capacity that involved the Corrali relationship. Specifically, Sarah, who was in the room, said nothing, but the bioluminescence at her temples shifted color to the warm amber that he had by now learned. The Corrali field expressed as contentment. He took a position as a senior liaison specialist attached to the Corrali embassy in the neutral zone. The Corps accommodated the arrangement with the specific efficiency of an organization that had been told by an Empress that it would accommodate it. The 30 years of suspended service were treated, for administrative purposes, as active duty in an unusual capacity, which raised his classification to a level that made the assignment appropriate. The work was good. He had always been good at it, and 30 years of absence had not changed the fundamental skills. The ability to read a situation accurately, to communicate clearly across the gaps that different civilizations create, to find the stable ground between what different parties needed and what they could actually give each other. He came to understand, in a unique position. He knew more about the Corrali political structure from 30 years of briefing documents than most humans would accumulate in a lifetime of engagement. And the Empress, who had been briefed on his work since she was 13, knew more about him than she should have known about anyone she had never formally met, which created a working relationship of unusual density from its first days. They met frequently. The frequency was operationally justified and was also clearly something else. He was not pretending not to notice, and she was not pretending she did not know he was noticing. The conversation about it, when it came, was a conversation he initiated. He was 64 years old and had been in suspension for 30 years and was not interested in the kind of prolonged ambiguity that younger versions of himself might have tolerated. He said, "I need to say something clearly, because I am apparently a person who steps in front of arrows without deciding to, and I would prefer to make this decision consciously." She said, "Say it." He said, "What is happening between us is something I would like to understand and then decide about, rather than allowing it to accumulate until neither of us can see it clearly." She said, "What do you see?" He said, "Something real. Something that started with an event I barely remember and that has been building through 30 years I missed in you, and that is now doing something I need to name before it names itself without me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The life debt creates an obligation. What I feel toward you is not the life debt. What is it? It is what I feel when I am in a room with the person who moved without deciding to because moving was what was right, and who wants to understand things before they accumulate, and who talks to me in my language badly enough that I can hear exactly how carefully he learned it." She paused. "It is also what I feel about the way you look at problems, and the way you look at me, when you think I do not notice you looking." He said, "I notice you looking back." She said, "I know." The conversation did not resolve everything immediately, because it was not the kind of conversation that resolves things immediately, but it was the beginning of a resolution that took time and was built from honesty on both sides and was eventually arrived at. The Corrali political establishment's response to the developing relationship between their empress and a human field specialist was not uniformly warm. This would have been an unrealistic expectation. The life debt framework gave it structural legitimacy that could not be argued with on Corrali terms. The resonant field, whose readings were the empirical foundation of Corrali political authority, registered the bond between them in ways that the Empress's field advisors documented carefully, and that those who were inclined to object found difficult to dispute through any mechanism their civilization recognized as valid. The human diplomatic community's response was a different kind of complicated. The liaison corps officially treated the situation as a personal matter outside their operational purview. Unofficially, the sector commander who processed the relevant notifications was reported to have said, in a private communication that nonetheless circulated, "The man stepped in front of 3 arrows for a 4-year-old. He didn't know if this is where it led. The universe has decent taste." Marcus's sister, when she was told she was still alive, 83 years old by then, fierce and clear-minded, was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She kept your facility funded for 22 years, starting when she was 13. Marcus. 13, he said. "I know." She said, "Don't make her wait again." He said, "I wasn't planning to." The formal recognition of the bond between the Empress of the unified Corrali sovereignty and Marcus Aldrich Webb was conducted according to Corrali tradition, which was appropriate since the life debt framework existed within Corrali law, and supplemented with a civil registration under human diplomatic law, which was appropriate since one of the parties was human. The Corrali ceremony involved the resonant field in ways that Marcus could not perceive directly, but that every Corrali present could, and that the recordings would later capture in the field measurement data that the Empress's advisors maintained as a matter of historical record. What the data showed was a field resonance at a frequency that had not been recorded in 400 years. The human ceremony was quiet. Witnesses from the liaison corps, from Marcus's sister's family, from the diplomatic corps. The words that were said were simple because they were being said between two people for whom the simple truth was more than sufficient. Outside the facility where the ceremony was held, the neutral zone was as it always was, that neutral space between civilizations where the business of connection happened, where people passed through on their way between the worlds they belonged to. 30 years ago, a man had been passing through a refugee settlement on his way between assignments. He had stopped because a colleague asked him to check on supplies. A child had been standing in the open. He had seen where the shooters were positioned. He had moved without deciding to everything else. Was everything else. The thing Marcus Webb came to understand. Over the years that followed, the years he was present for this time, the years that accumulated as his own, was something about the nature of the half-second decision that had changed everything. He had not made a moral calculation, he had not weighed outcomes, assessed probabilities, considered whether the child's survival justified the risk to himself. He had seen what was happening, and his body had moved in response to what it knew was right before his mind had finished processing the information. This was not heroism in the way that heroism was usually described. Not an act of will overcoming fear, not a moment of deliberate self-sacrifice. It was something closer to the full expression of who he was, visible in a half-second, because the half-second did not allow for the performance of something less true. He thought about this often in the years that followed, and he thought about what it meant for how you understand yourself, not based on what you decide to do when you have time to decide, though that matters, but based on what you do when there is no time, when the decision is made before it is consciously made, when the body acts from its deepest training. He had not known in that half-second that the child was a first bloodline Corrali with field sensitivity beyond anything in the historical record. He had not known she would become Empress. He had not known that 30 years would pass while he slept, or that she would fund the facility that kept him alive, starting at 13, or that she would fly to the neutral zone when his monitors changed and wait for him to wake and kneel on a medical room floor. He had known none of it. He had just moved, and the universe, it turned out, had been paying attention.